April 17, 1961. 1:15 local time, the southern coast of Cuba. A landing craft scraped against a coral reef 70 meters from a beach called Playa Girón. The men inside were Cuban exiles. They called themselves Brigade 2506. They were funded, trained, equipped, and commanded by the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States. 3 days later, they had been defeated. 114 of them were dead. 1,189 were prisoners. This is the story of the invasion that failed. But it is also the story of something else. 6 weeks after the defeat, the Director of Central Intelligence, Alan Dulles, asked his own Inspector General to investigate what had gone wrong. The man assigned to write that report was Lyman Kirkpatrick, a career CIA officer, a former chief of operations. He was given 6 months. He had unrestricted access. He interviewed 125 people. The report he produced was 150 pages long. It was a devastating internal critique. It described the agency as, quote, ignorant, dishonest, and arrogant. End quote. It was finished in October 1961. It was then locked in a CIA vault. It would not be declassified for 37 years. This is what the report actually said. To understand how one of the most powerful intelligence agencies in the world came to write a 150-page document criticizing itself, you have to understand the 18 months that came before the invasion. On January 1, 1959, Fidel Castro entered Havana. Within 12 months, his government had nationalized American-owned property valued at over $1 billion and had signed a trade agreement with the Soviet Union. On March 17, 1960, President Dwight Eisenhower signed a top-secret directive titled, quote, a program of covert action against the Castro regime, end quote. The directive authorized the CIA to organize, train, and equip a paramilitary force of Cuban exiles. The man who would design that operation was Richard Bissell, Deputy Director for Plans. A Yale economist, he had run the U-2 spy plane program. He had never planned an amphibious invasion in his life. The training base was called Trax. It was located in the mountains of Guatemala, 3,000 kilometers from Cuba. Between May 1960 and April 1961, more than 1,400 Cuban exiles passed through Trax. They learned small unit tactics, demolitions, and amphibious assault. They were promised something specific. They were promised that, when the time came, the United States would provide air cover. On January 20, 1961, John F. Kennedy was inaugurated. The plan he inherited from Eisenhower was already in motion. Kennedy had a problem. He had campaigned on a hard line against Cuba, but he had also promised, publicly, that no American military forces would be used to invade. To preserve what the CIA called plausible deniability, he made a decision. He authorized the operation, but he restricted the air cover. April 15, 1961, 8 B-26 bombers, painted in the markings of the Cuban Air Force and flown by Cuban exile pilots, took off from Nicaragua. Their target was 3 Cuban airfields. Their mission was to destroy Castro's air force on the ground. They damaged some aircraft. They missed others. A second airstrike was scheduled for April 17th, the day of the landing. It was cancelled. When word of the cancellation reached the CIA officers running the operation, one of them, according to declassified memoranda, reportedly said, quote, "This is the worst thing I have ever heard." End quote. The landing began at 01:15 on April 17th at Playa Girón and Playa Larga. By 06:30, Cuban Sea Furies and T-33 trainer jets, the aircraft the CIA had failed to destroy on April 15th, were attacking the landing fleet. The supply ships Houston and Rio Escondido were sunk. Most of the brigade's ammunition, communications equipment, and 10 days of food went to the bottom of the Caribbean. By the morning of April 18th, the brigade was running out of ammunition. By the evening of April 18th, Castro himself had arrived at the front. His forces numbered over 20,000. The brigade numbered 1,500. In Washington, in the early hours of April 19th, Admiral Arleigh Burke met with President Kennedy. He requested permission to launch jet aircraft from the carrier USS Essex. Kennedy refused. By the afternoon of April 19th, the brigade had collapsed. The next day, on April 20th, 1961, Kennedy stood before the American Society of Newspaper Editors. He said, quote, "There is an old saying that victory has 100 fathers and defeat is an orphan." End quote. He then said, quote, "I am the responsible officer of the government." End quote. In a private memo to his brother Robert, written within hours of that speech, Kennedy reportedly added 5 words. "How could I have been so stupid?" On June 1st, 1961, 6 weeks after the defeat, Allen Dulles called Lyman Kirkpatrick into his office. He told Kirkpatrick to investigate what had gone wrong. Kirkpatrick was an unusual choice. He had been chief of operations during the planning. He had been partially paralyzed by polio in 1952. He moved through CIA headquarters in a wheelchair. He was not, by reputation, deferential. For the next 4 months, Kirkpatrick interviewed 125 people. He read every cable, every plan, every after-action report. In October 1961, he submitted his findings to Dulles. The report ran 150 pages. This is what it said. Quote, "The agency became so wrapped up in the military operation that it failed to appreciate the political consequences of failure." End quote. Quote, "Plans were never reduced to a single, coherent, written document. Briefings to the president and senior officials were oral, fragmentary, and frequently inconsistent." End quote. Quote, "The agency was unable to provide policymakers with realistic estimates of the chances of success. There was no internal mechanism for skeptical review." End quote. Quote, "The Cuban exile force was militarily inadequate to its mission. The agency knew this. The agency did not communicate it clearly upward." End quote. Then, near the end, came the line that would later define the document. Quote, "Insofar as the agency engaged in this operation, it did so with insufficient appreciation of the gravity of what it was doing." End quote. When Dulles read the report, his reaction is partially preserved in declassified marginal notes. He disagreed with the conclusions. He blocked further distribution. 20 copies were originally printed. 19 were destroyed. 1 copy was sealed in the director's vault. For 37 years, no one outside a small circle of CIA leadership read it. In 1998, the National Security Archive, a non-governmental research institute, filed a Freedom of Information Act request. The CIA released the Kirkpatrick report on February 21, 1998. Page 1 was marked, quote, "This document was sequestered in the director's vault since approximately November 1961." End quote. 3 years later, in 2011, a separate document was released. It was a 5-volume internal history of the Bay of Pigs, written by CIA staff historian Jack Pfeiffer between 1973 and 1984. Pfeiffer's history was a defense of the agency. It directly contradicted Kirkpatrick. These 2 documents, the indictment and the defense, sat in the same archive. For 3 decades, both were classified. What happened on the beaches of Playa Girón is taught in every history textbook. What happened in the director's vault between 1961 and 1998 is not. The CIA wrote about itself in private with brutal honesty, and then it locked that document away for 37 years. This was the moment, according to multiple historians, when President Kennedy stopped trusting the agency. 18 months later, in October 1962, photographs from a U-2 spy plane would show Soviet missiles in Cuba. Kennedy would have to decide whether to believe what the CIA was telling him. He had read Kirkpatrick. That is another story.